The body of Lady Eleanor Whitcomb lay across the velvet chaise in the drawing-room of Whitcomb Manor. Her pale fingers curled rigidly around a golden locket, its chain broken. The fire flickered low, shadows trembling on the walls. Outside a storm raged, wind clawing at the windows. A scream had summoned the household to the ghastly scene. Her son, her daughter, her loyal maid, and her estranged nephew, all now suspects in a mystery that seemed as intricate as the delicate locket in her grasp. And in the silence that followed, the unmistakable voice of Hercule Poirot declared, Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm. The storm had been threatening all afternoon, rolling in great iron-gray banks across the Kentish countryside. By evening, when the lamps were lit in the windows of Whitcomb Manor, the heavens had opened in full fury. Rain lashed against the tall, mullioned panes. The wind shook ancient timbers, and the drive, long, winding, and already treacherous with mud, was rendered nearly impassable. It was the kind of night that pressed heavily upon the spirits, a night when secrets seemed eager to slip their bonds, when old houses whispered to themselves in the shrieking of the wind. Inside, however, warmth and light did their best to oppose the elements. Fires blazed in hearths, rich Persian rugs softened the echo of the oak floors, and the long drawing-room glowed with the shimmer of polished silver and cut glass. The atmosphere was almost too carefully cultivated, as though Lady Eleanor Whitcomb herself, formidable mistress of the house, had commanded the storm outside to rage, if only to highlight the serenity within. Lady Eleanor was a woman of presence. Tall, silver-haired, with features carved as finely as the marble busts that lined the hall, she carried with her a sense of command that neither age nor widowhood had diminished. In her 61st year, she remained sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed, and sharper of tongue than many of her juniors dared to endure. Those who crossed her often found themselves reduced to silence by a single look from her cold gray eyes. This evening she presided over her dining table as though it were a throne. The heavy Georgian table, been something of a prodigal relation, welcomed out of duty rather than affection. Last among the family was Miriam Blake, Lady Eleanor's maid, who had been promoted for the evening to attend in the dining room. She was a plain woman in her 40s, her face lined more from worry than age, and her devotion to Lady Eleanor was well known in the household. Her presence at table was unusual, but with the storm preventing servants from returning from the village, she had been pressed into service. At the foot of the table, however, sat the evening's most distinguished guests. Monsieur Hercule Poirot and his companion, Captain Arthur Hastings. Poirot, the little Belgian detective whose reputation had spread far beyond the continent, cut a curious figure among the tall Englishmen. His egg-shaped head gleamed under the candlelight, his mustaches were immaculately waxed, and his dark eyes missed nothing. Hastings, bluff, affable, and eternally astonished by his friend's methods, was delighted at the prospect of a country house weekend, though the storm had rendered it less than convivial. Dinner began with all the ritual of English formality. Soup was ladled, pheasant carved, and a fine burgundy poured. Yet beneath the polite exchanges, Poirot detected currents of unease, threads of tension that tugged at every glance, every word that faltered on the tongue. Charles spoke little, except to request more wine, which he consumed with the practiced haste of one too familiar with its solace. Clara, by contrast, spoke brightly of music, of London theaters, of acquaintances in society, but her eyes darted often to her mother, as though gauging approval. Edward's voice cut across the conversation with sardonic wit, his remarks edged with bitterness that suggested old grievances. Lady Eleanor presided over it all with regal composure, permitting no overt quarrel, though her silences were eloquent. It was Hastings, ever oblivious to undercurrents, who attempted to lighten matters. "A fine old house you have here, Lady Whitcomb. I dare say it has seen many a storm such as this one." Lady Eleanor inclined her head. "Whitcomb Manor has stood these 4 centuries." Meanwhile, hinted darkly at promises broken and inheritance delayed. Each remark was a spark, and Lady Eleanor's responses, though controlled, only fanned the flames. Poirot observed it all with quiet amusement. To Hastings he whispered, "You see, mon ami, how a family may sit together and yet be divided by oceans. Regard them, each an island, each resenting the tides that lap upon their shores." Hastings frowned, failing to grasp the metaphor. "I thought they seemed rather civil," he murmured. Poirot's mustaches twitched. "Ah, you see, but you do not observe." Dessert was served, but few partook with appetite. At last, Lady Eleanor rose, signaling the end of the meal. "We shall take coffee in the drawing-room," she announced, her tone brooking no dissent. The drawing-room, with its gilt-framed mirrors, heavy velvet drapes, and the faint scent of roses lingering from the afternoon, was a chamber of wealth and memory. Portraits of Whitcomb's long dead gazed down from the walls, their eyes seeming to judge the living. Coffee was poured, liqueurs offered, and the storm outside roared ever more violently. It was here in this chamber that the evening reached its peculiar climax. Clara sat by the piano, idly striking chords but refusing to sing. Charles paced restlessly, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Edward leaned against the mantel, smoking with insolent ease. Lady Eleanor occupied the chaise longue, her spine as straight as the oak paneling, her eyes sharp and watchful. Poirot and Hastings conversed in low tones, but even Hastings began to sense the oppressive atmosphere. It was as though the storm outside had entered the room, pressing down upon them all. Then, quite suddenly, Lady Eleanor rose. In her hand something glittered in the firelight, a delicate golden locket suspended from a broken chain. She regarded it as one might regard a viper. "This," she said coldly, "was left in my room. I do not know who placed it there, nor..." The scream that followed Lady Eleanor's collapse had barely faded when the storm outside reached a new crescendo, hammering against the windows as though eager to break into the chamber and claim its prize. For a moment, all was confusion. Clara sobbing, Charles cursing under his breath, Edward striding forward with the air of a man determined to wrest control, and Miriam wringing her hands, half hysterical. But Hercule Poirot was calm. He bent once more over Lady Eleanor's body, his delicate fingers pressing against the slender wrist, his sharp eyes scanning the rigid lines of her face. The golden locket glittered in her clenched hand, its chain snapped clean through, its surface catching the firelight with unsettling beauty. "She is gone," he said gravely, rising to his feet. "The life, it has departed." "Good God!" Hastings exclaimed, running a hand through his hair. "But how, Poirot?" There was no sound, nothing but that thunderclap. Poirot inclined his head. "Ah, may see, there was a sound. A small one, a cry cut short. It is often so when death comes unexpectedly, no? But the manner of this death, that is the question." Charles barked impatiently. Surely it was her heart. Mother's always had trouble. She has been under strain. Poirot's gaze flicked to him, sharp as a rapier. You think so, monsieur? The lady was strong as an oak. I do not believe that the storm alone carried her away. No, no, there is more here, I am convinced. Clara, pale and trembling, clutched at the back of a chair. Are you suggesting murder? Poirot's mustaches twitched. I suggest nothing, mademoiselle. I observe. I await the facts. But I will say this. Lady Eleanor did not die of chance. Something, or someone, assisted her on this path. The words struck the room like a stone cast into still water. Each face registered shock, denial, or, in one case, thinly veiled calculation. Edward Haraway was the first to recover. If what you say is true, monsieur, then we must summon the body. Miriam hovered anxiously, wringing her hands and murmuring prayers under her breath. Poirot let the storm of protest expend itself, then raised his voice, sharp and commanding. Silence! The word cracked like a whip. To everyone's surprise, it was obeyed. Now, we shall proceed with order. Each of you will remain in the house until the authorities arrive. Each of you will give me an account of yourself, and we shall see where the truth leads us. He glanced at Hastings. Mon ami, will you be so good as to fetch writing materials? I shall take notes. Every detail may prove important. Hastings nodded, grateful for something to do, and hurried off. Charles Whitcomb was the first to be questioned. He was truculent, defiant, and restless, pacing the drawing room like a caged animal. His hair clung damply to his forehead, his tie askew. Really, this is absurd, he said, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. You'd think I had some motive for harming my mother. It was no secret she and I had our differences, but that's hardly reason for murder. Poirot inclined his head. You quarreled at dinner, monsieur. You asked her for money. She refused. Charles flushed angrily. What of it? Families quarrel. You cannot mean perhaps, said Poirot softly. But it is a curious thing to ask for money on such a night, no? And the locket. Did you know of it? The locket? Charles's eyes flicked briefly towards the chaise where the body lay. I've never seen it before in my life. Poirot did not press, but his eyes missed nothing. The quick flare of recognition, the attempt to mask it, the telltale twitch of a mouth too ready to deny. Clara Whitcomb was questioned next. Her dark eyes were swollen from tears, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief until the threads threatened to snap. My mother was difficult, she admitted in a low voice. But she was never cruel. She had high standards, that is all. I loved her, despite everything. Yet you quarreled, Poirot said gently. Edward shrugged. Of course. She held the purse strings tight, as always. I thought she might loosen them now I had returned from abroad, but no. Lady Eleanor was never one to change her mind. But that hardly means I strangled her in her own drawing room. Poirot's gaze sharpened. You speak of strangling, monsieur. Yet I did not say how she died. For the first time, Edward faltered. His cigarette burned too quickly between his fingers. It was only a figure of speech, he muttered. Poirot said nothing, merely noted the slip in his little notebook. Miriam Blake, the maid, was last. She was trembling so violently she could scarcely hold her apron. Tears streamed down her plain face as she stammered. My lady was kind to me, kinder than I deserved. I served her for 20 years. I would never, never harm her. God strike me if I lie." Poirot's voice was gentle. "And yet, you knew of the locket." Miriam's eyes widened in terror. "The locket? No, sir, I swear." She stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth. I only meant, I saw her with it once, long ago. She kept it in her jewel box. I never asked." Poirot leaned forward. "And what was inside, do you know?" Miriam's lips moved soundlessly, but she shook her head. Poirot did not press. He merely closed his notebook and studied her with those piercing dark eyes. The storm battered on. The fire guttered. The household huddled together in uneasy silence. Poirot stood by the chaise, gazing down at Lady Eleanor's still form. The golden locket glimmered in her hand. At last he bent, pried gently at her stiffening fingers, and lifted the trinket free. The clasp was delicate but scratched, as though forced shut. With deft pressure he opened it. Gasps sounded around the room. Inside, set beneath the fragile glass, was a miniature portrait of a child. A girl of perhaps 6 years old, with wide eyes and a tumble of dark curls. None of those present seemed to recognize her. Yet the portrait's Charles' cigarette trembled between his fingers, and Edward, ever the cynic, let out a low whistle. Only Miriam, standing by the door with her apron twisted in her hands, seemed on the verge of collapse. "A child," Hastings murmured. "Good heavens, Poirot, what could this mean?" Poirot regarded the miniature portrait gravely, then snapped the locket shut. "It means, mon ami, that Lady Eleanor Whitcomb carried a secret to her grave. And perhaps," his mustaches quivered, "perhaps it is the reason that grave came sooner than expected." Charles gave a harsh laugh. "Surely you're not suggesting that this trinket, this picture of some brat no one knows, has anything to do with her death?" Poirot's eyes darted to him, sharp as a pin. "Ah, monsieur, but you forget. It was in her hand as she died. One does not grasp so tightly that which is meaningless. No, this locket is of great importance. Lady Eleanor sought to protect it, or to reveal it. Either way, someone wished her silent." Clara's voice trembled. "But who is she, that child? My mother never spoke of such a person. I don't understand." Edward flicked ash into the fire with deliberate nonchalance. "Really, cousin, it isn't difficult to understand. Our dear aunt may not have been the paragon of virtue she liked to appear. The child could have been, well, an indiscretion, tucked away in secrecy. Such things happen in families more august than ours." Clara flinched as though struck. "How dare you?" Poirot raised a hand. "Enough. We deal in facts, not scandalous suppositions. Until we know the truth of this child's identity, we can say nothing." He turned to Miriam. The maid's face was ashen, her eyes fixed on the locket with an intensity that did not escape him. "Mademoiselle Blake," he said softly, "you have seen this child before, n'est-ce pas?" Miriam shook her head so violently her cap slipped. "No, sir, no. I swear it on my soul, I don't know her." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps. Storm and the dead." Poirot's eyes lingered upon Lady Eleanor's face. "So proud, so strong," he murmured. "And yet even the strongest may fall when secrets are threatened." Hastings shivered, Do you think she was murdered for the locket, Poirot? Poirot glanced at him. It is possible, mon ami. But remember, murder is not so simple. The locket, the portrait, they are but the surface. Beneath, there are currents we do not yet see. He paced the room, scanning the floor, the furniture, the very shadows. His gaze sharpened as he bent near the hearth. With a quick movement, he plucked something from the carpet, a torn scrap of silk, delicate and pale, its edge embroidered with a single letter, C. Poirot held it up to the light. Ah, another piece in our puzzle. Tell me, Hastings, what do you make of this? Hastings frowned. Well, it looks like a woman's handkerchief, perhaps. The C could be Clara's. Good Lord, Poirot, you don't think... Poirot's eyes glimmered. I think nothing yet, mon ami. But it is most suggestive, is it not? A locket, a child's portrait, and now a fragment bearing the letter C. Someone sought to point the finger, perhaps. Or perhaps the truth is indeed so direct. But we must not leap like the English fox at the first scent. He placed the scrap carefully in his pocketbook. Clues, Hastings. They are like the pieces of a jigsaw. One must not force them into place. Let them fall as they will, and then, then, the picture, it emerges. The fire died low. The house seemed to groan under the storm's assault. Poirot, with one last glance at the body of Lady Eleanor, drew the curtains across the chaise, shrouding her in dignity. Come, mon ami, he said softly. The storm outside, it is violent, yes. But within this house there is a storm far greater. The truth, it is waiting to break. Softly, the night it obscures, but the morning it illuminates. Already the scene it speaks. I glanced about uncertainly. It looks much the same to me, mais non. Regardez. He pointed delicately with the tip of his cane. There, the carpet beneath the chaise. A mark, faint but present. Something small and sharp was dropped, then retrieved. Perhaps a key, perhaps a pin. And there, at the window, the latch, it is undone. You note it? I crossed to the tall French doors leading onto the terrace. The latch was indeed loose, the metal catch rattling faintly when I touched it. Could someone have entered here? I asked. Poirot's mustaches twitched. The storm, it was violent. Few would risk the rain. Yet, if one wished to come unseen, the noise of the thunder, it would conceal much. A possibility, Hastings. Always we keep the possibilities open. He stooped suddenly and plucked at the carpet near the door. When he straightened, he held a small object in his palm. A fragment of dried mud clinging to a sliver of fabric. A footprint, he murmured, and with it a trace of cloth, dark, perhaps wool. Very interesting. We had little time to dwell upon it, for soon the household began to stir. Clara was the first to enter, her face pale from a sleepless night, her eyes still swollen from tears. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, glancing often toward the empty chaise as though expecting her mother to reappear. Lady Clara, Poirot began gently. You were close to your mother, yes? Yes, she whispered. At least, I tried to be. But she was a difficult woman. Proud, secretive. Still, I loved her dearly. Poirot inclined his head. Tell me, did she ever speak of a child other than yourself? A child of the family, perhaps, or a ward? Clara's eyes widened. Never. The picture in that locket. I cannot explain it. Dinner. Charles waved a hand. She was being impossible, as usual. Something about money. She accused me of extravagance. Well, I won't deny I've had debts, but nothing serious. Certainly nothing to kill her for. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, but you see, money, it is often at the root of family disputes, and sometimes of crime. Charles' face darkened. You're wasting your time. If anyone had a reason to want her gone, it was Edward. He hated her control over the estate. Poirot made a delicate note in his book. Perhaps. Or perhaps she was killed for another reason altogether. We shall see, monsieur. When Charles departed, Edward entered. He sauntered in with lazy grace, a cigarette already alight. He dropped into a chair and regarded Poirot with a sardonic smile. Well, detective, I suppose you'll accuse me next. Poirot spread his hands. I accuse no one, monsieur. I ask questions. Then ask away. I've nothing to hide. You disliked Lady Eleanor? I found her insufferable, Edward replied coolly. Domineering, sanctimonious, always meddling. If she thought she could run my life as she pleased, she was mistaken. Yet she controlled the estate's finances, did she not? You depended on her allowance. Edward blew a smoke ring. And if I did? That hardly makes me a murderer. Plenty of us were chafing under her thumb. Poirot tapped his notebook. And the locket. What do you know of it? Edward's eyes flickered, just for a moment. Nothing. I saw it for the first time last night. Some sentimental nonsense, no doubt. She always had her secrets. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Yet secrets, monsieur, are dangerous things. They destroy families more surely than poverty. Are you certain you have told me all? Edward shrugged, avoiding his gaze. Believe what you like. I've said my piece. It was Miriam Blake who entered last. The maid looked even more haggard than before, her hands trembling as she clasped her apron. She curtsied stiffly, the pattern we must discover. And look. He gestured to the terrace doors. The footprint, the torn fabric. These are tangible. Lies, they can mislead. But the mud, the latch, the handkerchief fragment, those, they speak the truth. He turned to me suddenly. Hastings, you recall the letter box in the hall? Yes, what of it? Poirot's eyes gleamed. This morning, before any of the household descended, I observed the butler carrying up the post. Among the envelopes was one addressed in Lady Eleanor's hand. A letter written yesterday, the very day she died. My heart gave a leap. Good heavens, to whom? Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. That, mon ami, is what we must discover. For I believe that letter may hold the key to the mystery of the Golden Locket and the shadow it has cast upon this house. Chapter 5. The Vanished Letter. The morning light crept cautiously into Whitcomb Manor, casting long shadows across its paneled corridors and glinting off the silver trays laid for breakfast. The storm of the previous night had left the air raw and damp, and the household gathered in the dining room with an unease that no amount of coffee or toast could dispel. Charles attacked his kippers with forced gusto. Clara stirred her tea without drinking, and Edward lounged in his chair, smoking despite Clara's protests. Miriam moved about silently with the coffee pot, her eyes downcast, though I noticed her glance nervously each time Poirot's gaze flickered toward her. Poirot, as ever, was immaculate, his mustaches impeccable, his napkin folded with geometric precision. He ate little, speaking scarcely a word, yet I could see his mind whirring behind those sharp eyes. At last, when plates were cleared and silence had grown unbearable, he rose. "Messieurs, mesdames," he said smoothly, "if you will indulge me, I have questions concerning the letters of yesterday evening." Charles frowned. "Letters? What letters?" Poirot inclined his head. "Precisely. There should have been several delivered this morning, oui? But one, written by Lady Eleanor herself, is missing." A collective murmur swept the table. Clara's eyes widened. "Mother wrote a letter? To whom?" "That, mademoiselle, is what we must determine. You see, I observed it myself last night, before the household retired. It was placed in the hall box, ready for posting. This morning," his finger tapped the table for emphasis, "it was gone." Edward exhaled a ribbon of smoke. "Perhaps she changed her mind and destroyed it herself." "No," Poirot replied softly. "Lady Eleanor was dead before it could be destroyed. Someone else removed it, and that someone fears what the letter contained." Charles gave a harsh laugh. "Then perhaps it was addressed to her lawyer, about her will. That would certainly explain why someone might wish it never to be read." Clara gasped. "Do you passed it in the hall during the night?" Poirot tapped his chin. "And you noticed nothing unusual? No stranger within the house?" Jennings' brow creased. "No one, monsieur. Though—" he hesitated. "Yes. There were footprints upon the terrace this morning, leading away from the French doors of the drawing room. I thought them curious, but assumed they belonged to some member of the household." Poirot's eyes glimmered. "Curious indeed. Merci, Jennings. That will be all." We returned to the drawing room where the family awaited with visible impatience. Poirot seated himself deliberately, letting silence stretch until even Edward's nonchalant pose began to falter. "Mademoiselle Clara," Poirot began suddenly, "did your mother confide in you yesterday? Speak of correspondence, or of some revelation she intended?" Clara shook her head. "No, nothing. She was quiet all day, withdrawn. I thought it merely fatigue. Yet she wrote a letter. You have no idea to whom?" Her eyes brimmed with tears. "None, I swear it." Poirot regarded her gravely, then turned to Charles. "And you, monsieur? Did your aunt mention writing?" Charles flushed. "No, but as I said, it could have been her lawyer. She had threatened often enough to cut Edward off." Edward sprang to his feet. "Lies! She was far more likely to change her will in my favor than yours, you spendthrift. Gentlemen," Poirot's voice cracked like a whip, "this is not helpful. Sit, if you please. We seek truth, not accusations." Edward flung himself back into his chair with a mutter. Poirot's eyes did not leave him. "And you, monsieur? Where were you between 9 and 10 o'clock last night?" Edward smirked. "In my room, reading. Ask anyone." "Alone?" Yes, what of it? Poirot's mustaches twitched. Alone, monsieur, is never a satisfactory alibi. One must rely upon one's own word. And words, they can be cheap. Edward's smile faltered. Poirot now turned to Miriam. Letter? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Exactement. Someone sought to destroy it, but not thoroughly. Regardez, Hastings, the ink, it is still visible. The child. What child, eh? The one in the locket? It seems Lady Eleanor meant to reveal something at last, and someone feared it. He slipped the fragment into an envelope, sealing it carefully. We are closer, mon ami, much closer. The room seemed to darken as clouds swept across the sun. Clara clutched her handkerchief, Edward stared grimly into space, and Charles muttered under his breath. Miriam stood apart, silent, eyes fixed upon the hearth as though haunted by what the fire had failed to consume. Poirot straightened, smoothing his coat. His gaze swept the gathering, sharp and unyielding. Mes amis, he said softly, we now know this. Lady Eleanor wrote of the child. The letter was stolen, destroyed. Therefore, that child is the heart of the matter. Who she is, why she was hidden, and why her existence provoked murder. That is what we must uncover. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle upon them. Mark me well. The killer sits among us, and until I discover them, none of you is safe. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the tick of the mantel clock. I saw Clara shiver, Edward's jaw tighten, Charles shift restlessly, Miriam pale, further still. Poirot's eyes glittered with certainty. Then softly, as though to himself, he added, the child in the locket, she is the ghost who walks these halls. And until we give her a name, there will be no peace. Chapter 6. Shadows of Alibis. The storm had cleansed the air, leaving Whitcomb Manor washed in a cold brilliance. Sunlight spilled reluctantly across the lawns, glistening upon the wet gravel paths and catching in the leaves still heavy with rain. Yet for all the brightness of the morning, the atmosphere within the house was one of gloom and unease, as though the walls themselves remembered the crime of the night before. Poirot and I set out across the terrace to examine the grounds more closely. Unseen. To leave after a deed done. His gaze returned to the French doors. The latch hung slightly ajar, rattling faintly in the breeze. Poirot touched it delicately. Tampered with. Yes, someone ensured it could be opened easily. Ah, such care. But in the end, they leave behind the little details which betray them. We re-entered the house where Jennings awaited with his habitual gravity. Poirot summoned him to the library and questioned him anew. You retire at what hour, monsieur? Poirot asked. Usually by 10, sir, unless my lady required me. Last night I remained awake until 11:30 to see to the household. The storm had caused some damage in the kitchens. And between 9 and 10, Jennings considered. I was occupied in the pantry, sir. The bell rang twice for coffee service, once from the drawing room, once from Lady Eleanor's chamber. Miriam answered both, I believe. Ah, Miriam, Poirot mused. We must consider her movements carefully. Jennings inclined his head. Indeed, sir. She seemed disturbed, more than the rest. I thought perhaps the storm unsettled her. Or something else, Poirot murmured. Merci, Jennings. That will be all. We resumed our inquiries with the family. Poirot gathered Clara, Charles, and Edward in the morning room, where the pale light fell coldly upon their strained faces. Mes amis, Poirot began. The truth, it will not hide forever. Last night, between 9 and 10, each of you must account for your actions. Let us begin with you, Lady Clara. Clara twisted her handkerchief. I was in my room after dinner. I felt unwell and retired early. Miriam brought me tea just before 9. I remained there until the dreadful news came. Poirot nodded. And you, Monsieur Charles? Charles shifted uneasily. I was in the billiard room. The storm was infernal, and I thought to distract myself. I played several games alone. Jennings can tell you. The balls were left upon the table. Poirot's eyes narrowed. But who saw? Never, never harm her. Poirot inclined his head gravely. I believe you, mademoiselle. Yet, such quarrels leave wounds, and wounds can be exploited by others. Later, Miriam was summoned. She entered pale and trembling, her hands clutching her apron as though it were a shield. Poirot's voice was gentle but unyielding. Mademoiselle, we must know. Where were you between 9 and 10? Her eyes darted fearfully. I carried tea to Lady Clara at 9, as Jennings said. Then Lady Eleanor rang for me. I went to her chamber with coffee. She dismissed me quickly. After that, I went to my own room, sir. I could not bear the storm. Yet Jennings did not see you return, Poirot observed. I passed through the back passage, sir. He would not have noticed. Perhaps, Poirot said softly. But the timing, it is most interesting. You were alone for nearly half an hour? Yes, sir, Miriam whispered. Poirot's gaze lingered upon her trembling form. One day soon, mademoiselle, you will tell me everything. Until then, I advise you, be careful. Silence. It can destroy more surely than words. In the afternoon, Poirot and I returned to the terrace. The grass still held the memory of footprints, faint and broken by rain. Poirot moved slowly, scanning with his keen eyes, until suddenly he bent with a cry of triumph. Voila! Hastings, see what the storm has not taken. He held up a small key, its surface tarnished, its bow delicate and ornate. Mud clung to its grooves, but its form was unmistakable. A key, I exclaimed. But to what? Poirot turned it in his gloved fingers, eyes gleaming. Not to a door, mon ami. Observe the size, it is too small. This is the key of a drawer, perhaps a casket, something meant to conceal private things. Lady Eleanor's desk, I cried. Exactement, Poirot said softly. And if that is so, then someone sought access to her secrets. Perhaps the very secrets that letter would have revealed. We returned inside, where Poirot tested the key discreetly. In Lady Eleanor's private writing desk, he found a drawer whose lock resisted until, click, it opened with the recovery. Shadows lengthened across Whitcomb Manor. Poirot sat alone in the library, gazing thoughtfully at the fire. I joined him, curious at his silence. Poirot, I said, you have discovered much. The missing letter, the burnt fragment, the key. Surely you are close to the truth. Poirot smiled faintly. Close, yes, but not yet complete. There is still the question of the child. Who she is, why Lady Eleanor guarded her secret, and why that secret brought death. Until we know, Hastings, the case remains shrouded. He leaned forward, eyes glinting in the firelight. But mark my words. Tomorrow, I shall speak with each suspect again. And this time, they will not so easily evade Hercule Poirot. The flames crackled, casting his shadow long upon the wall, while outside the night gathered like a conspirator, heavy with unspoken truths. Chapter 7. The drawing room confrontations. The storm had passed, leaving the grounds of Whitcomb Manor veiled in mist. Yet, within the house, the atmosphere was charged with a different tempest, one of whispered suspicions and uneasy silences. The household moved with strained courtesy, eyes averted, voices low, as though each feared what another might reveal. Poirot, however, was in his element. His small figure moved briskly through the corridors, his patent leather shoes shining, his mustaches bristling with quiet determination. "Hastings," he said, drawing me aside. "Today we apply the pressure. When the pot boils, the scum rises to the surface, yes? So it is with murder. We shall bring them all together and watch how the lies begin to crack." He summoned Jennings, who with unfailing dignity announced that the household was requested to assemble in the drawing room at 11 o'clock. The butler's solemn tones carried through the house like the toll of a bell. By the appointed hour, the family and staff had gathered. The drawing room, with its tall windows and faded elegance, became a stage upon which Poirot would direct his drama. "That you played games, solitary, yes?" Charles shrugged. "I did. I told you already." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Just so. And yet, when I visited that room this morning, I found the chalk untouched, the cues neatly in their place, the balls arranged in the rack. It did not speak of recent use." Charles flushed, then scowled. "Perhaps I tidied before leaving. Is that a crime?" "Not a crime, monsieur, merely a curiosity. For one who claims to have played several games, it is unusual to leave the room so immaculate, n'est-ce pas?" Charles muttered something under his breath and looked away. Poirot allowed the silence to linger, letting the weight of the doubt settle. Next, Poirot turned to Edward. "And you, monsieur, alone in your chamber, reading a book. Which book, if you please?" Edward's lips curved in a faint smile. "A volume of Shakespeare, Richard III." "Ah, an excellent choice," Poirot said softly. "And tell me, how far did you read?" Edward hesitated. Half a dozen pages, perhaps." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Curious. For I visited your chamber this morning. The book lay upon your desk, yes, but open at the very beginning. No pages turned, no bookmark inserted. If you read, it left no trace." Edward's hand twitched, the cigarette burning low between his fingers. "You're making too much of nothing, Poirot." "Perhaps," Poirot agreed mildly. "Or perhaps, monsieur, you make too little of everything." Poirot shifted his attention to Clara, his voice gentling. "Mademoiselle, forgive me. Your heart, it is heavy. Yet we must speak of your mother. You quarreled, yes? About Captain Harcourt." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Yes. She hated him, called him fortune hunter, adventurer. But she was wrong. She never understood him." "And you?" Poirot asked softly. "The greater betrayal." Miriam covered her face, trembling. Poirot did not press her further. Then, with sudden energy, Poirot drew from his pocket the fragment of burnt paper. He held it aloft, the charred edge black against the pale sheet. This, mes amis, is what remains of a letter. A letter Lady Eleanor held in her hand when she died. A letter she tried to destroy, or one another destroyed for her. It spoke of a secret child. That child is the key to all. For the murderer killed not merely to silence Lady Eleanor, but to bury forever the truth of that child's existence. The words fell like stones into the silence. I saw Clara's lips tremble. Charles gripped the arm of his chair. Edward exhaled smoke in a sharp hiss. Miriam gave a stifled cry and looked desperately toward the floor. Poirot let his gaze sweep the room. His voice dropped, low and deliberate. And so I say this. The murderer is here, in this room. One among you feared that child, feared the revelation of blood and name. One among you struck Lady Eleanor down. The silence was suffocating. Jennings shifted slightly. His impassive mask unbroken, though his eyes flickered with something unreadable. Poirot allowed the tension to build, then continued with quiet emphasis. There is one more piece of the puzzle. The golden locket. Lady Eleanor wore it always. It contained a miniature portrait, perhaps, or a lock of hair, something that revealed the truth. But the locket is gone. Where is it now? Hidden, perhaps, within these very walls. And when it is found, mes amis. He paused, letting his words fall with the weight of prophecy. It will name the killer. The household erupted into murmurs. Clara sobbed openly. Charles swore under his breath. Edward stubbed out his cigarette with unnecessary violence. Miriam buried her face in her hands. Poirot raised a hand and silence returned. His voice was firm, resonant. I warn you all, the noose of truth tightens. Already the lies unravel. Soon, eyes alert. His mustaches quivering as if tuned to some unseen vibration. Hastings, he said as we climbed the staircase toward Lady Eleanor's chamber. Today we hunt not for a murderer, but for a thing. And in the finding of the thing we shall come closer to the truth of the person. Yes, it is always so. The object, it betrays the hand that covets it. Lady Eleanor's bedroom had been left largely untouched since her death. The heavy curtains hung half-drawn, casting the chamber in a solemn twilight. The scent of her perfume still lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the wax polish of the furniture. Poirot crossed to the dressing table with reverence, his gloved hands touching nothing, his gaze sweeping every surface. Observe, Hastings, the jewel case. It is ornate, yes, but too ornate. Lady Eleanor, she was a woman of taste. This piece, it is not for display but for concealment. He lifted the case, turning it delicately. With a soft click, he pressed the filigreed clasp, and the lid opened to reveal a velvet-lined interior. Rings, brooches, and pearls lay within, their arrangement orderly. Yet Poirot's attention fixed upon a small recess at the back. "Eh bien," he murmured. "You see how the velvet is worn in a circle, just so. It once held something of weight, round perhaps, on a chain." "The locket!" I exclaimed. Poirot inclined his head. "Exactement. And now it is gone. Not mislaid, Hastings. Removed. With purpose. Tell me, mon ami, who would risk so much to take it after death, unless it contained the very evidence they feared?" He closed the case gently, his expression grave. We must ask, who had access to this room after Lady Eleanor was found? Jennings, Miriam, perhaps one of the family? Ah, but the list, it is not long. The staff were summoned again, and Miriam appeared pale and trembling. Poirot addressed her kindly, though with firmness. Mademoiselle, tension in his eyes. Charles, mon ami, Poirot said smoothly. Your finances, they are not comfortable, are they? The debts, they grow, yes? Your creditors, they become impatient. Charles stiffened. That's none of your concern. Ah, but it is. Lady Eleanor, she held the purse strings. She denied you funds, did she not? And if the locket contained proof of a scandal, something that could strip the family of fortune and name, why, monsieur, you would have motive indeed to silence her. Charles' face flushed dark. Damn you, Poirot, you twist everything. Yes, I needed money. Yes, she refused me. But I didn't kill her for it. Poirot's eyes glittered. Perhaps. Or perhaps you did not hold the knife, but you shielded the one who did. Charles swore under his breath and stormed out. Poirot watched him go, his mustaches twitching with amusement. Edward was next. He entered with his usual languid air, though the faint tremor in his hand betrayed unease. Poirot wasted no time. Monsieur Edward, tell me, did you know of Lady Eleanor's secret? Did you know of the child? Edward's eyes flickered. What nonsense is this? Ah, but not nonsense. Proof exists. A locket with a curl of hair. A photograph. And Lady Eleanor, she sent a letter the night she died, warning of revelation. To whom would that truth be most dangerous? To the eldest son, perhaps. To the heir who must preserve the family's good name. Edward's composure cracked for the briefest moment. His lips tightened, his eyes narrowed. You presume too much, Poirot. My mother was eccentric, prone to melodrama. Any letter she wrote was nothing but fancy. Poirot's gaze did not waver. No, monsieur. The truth is not fancy. It is like the flame. It burns away all falsehood. And soon, it will burn you. Edward turned sharply and left, his cigarette case snapping. Harm. Poirot regarded her gravely. Perhaps, mademoiselle, or perhaps you meant to conceal it forever. Either way, your search, it is clumsy. He bent, his sharp eyes catching what she had uncovered. A small scrap of golden silk ribbon, frayed at the edges, half buried beneath the carpet's fold. He lifted it delicately, holding it to the light. The chain of the locket, he murmured. It was here. Someone dropped it in their haste. And that someone, Hastings, was here after Lady Eleanor's death. Miriam gave a choked sob and fled the room. Poirot stood, the ribbon gleaming in his hand, his eyes alight with triumph. You see, mon ami, he whispered. Step by step, the truth comes nearer. The locket is not gone from Whitcomb Manor. It waits, hidden, for Hercule Poirot to uncover it. And when I do, the murderer will stand revealed. Chapter 9. Poirot sets the trap. The morning dawned pale and chill, the mist lingering over the lawns like a veil that refused to lift. Whitcomb Manor seemed imprisoned in that haze, its windows blind, its chimneys mute. Yet within, the atmosphere was anything but still. Rumors, glances, and whispers circled the corridors like restless spirits. Poirot chose his moment with exquisite care. At breakfast, while Jennings presided in his grave manner, and the family gathered with strained civility, Poirot cleared his throat delicately and spoke in tones that cut through the silence. Mes amis, I have a little announcement. The Golden Locket. It has been found. The effect was electric. Clara gasped, her teacup clattering against its saucer. Charles sat upright, color rising in his cheeks. Edward's hand froze halfway to his mouth, the toast untouched. Miriam gave a strangled cry and pressed her hands to her face. Poirot inclined his head calmly. Yes, it is so. The locket is safe, and in due time we shall see what truths it contains. But already I know enough to say this. Its contents will shatter illusions and reveal the hand that killed Lady Eleanor. A silence followed, thick with uneasily. I've told you. I was at the table. Poirot gestured. Then, explain to us why the balls were neatly racked, the cues in their place, the chalk unused. A man who plays several games leaves disorder, yet the room bore no sign of activity. Charles flushed. Perhaps I tidied. Perhaps I didn't play as long as I thought. What does it matter? It matters greatly, Poirot said softly. Because if you were not in the billiard room, then you were elsewhere. And where, monsieur, if not in that room, did you go? Charles' mouth tightened. He'll not be interrogated like a criminal. Poirot bowed slightly. Then remain silent if you choose. But silence, it too speaks. Edward was next. Poirot fixed him with a piercing gaze. And you, monsieur, in your chamber, reading Shakespeare. But the book lay open at its first page. You had not read beyond the beginning. So I ask again, where were you truly? Edward's expression did not falter, but his voice carried an edge of steel. I was in my room. If the book lay at the beginning, it is because I fell asleep before I read more. Poirot's mustaches quivered. So you say. Yet your shoes were damp, the soles muddied. Not from walking the corridors, but from stepping outside, perhaps. Onto the terrace. Edward's eyes flashed. You dare accuse me? Without proof? Poirot raised a finger. On the contrary, monsieur. I present proof. From his pocket he drew the fragment of golden ribbon, frayed and faintly stained with mud. He held it aloft, gleaming in the firelight. This was found beneath the carpet in Lady Eleanor's chamber. Torn from the chain of the locket, dropped in haste. And I say this, whoever entered her room after her death left this behind. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps. Charles cursed softly. Edward's face was carved from stone. Miriam made a sound between a sob and a scream, covering her mouth as if to stifle the truth. Poirot let the silence deepen. Treasure all her life? No, monsieur. Lady Eleanor was not senile. She was afraid. Edward said nothing, but his jaw clenched until the veins stood out. Poirot raised his hand, commanding silence. His voice was calm, yet carried an undertone of steel. Tomorrow I shall reveal all. The murderer's identity, the truth of the child, the meaning of the locket. I have nearly all the pieces. Only one or two remain hidden. But the murderer, they grow desperate. Tonight they may act again. And so, mes amis, be vigilant. He turned his gaze from one to another, holding each in his steady scrutiny. Remember this. The truth, it is inexorable. Like the dawn, it cannot be halted. By this time tomorrow the sun shall rise, and Hercule Poirot will unmask the killer. The fire crackled, the mist pressed against the windows, and in that charged silence I felt the whole house tremble beneath the weight of his words. Chapter 10. The Truth in the Golden Locket. The library of Whitcomb Manor had never seemed so solemn, nor so charged with expectation. Heavy curtains had been drawn against the encroaching dusk. The lamps glowed with a subdued brilliance, and the fire burned low, casting restless shadows upon the shelves of ancient books. Into this chamber Poirot had summoned them all. Clara, pale and trembling. Charles, restless and flushed. Miriam, silent and withdrawn. Edward, erect and coldly composed. Jennings the butler stood discreetly at the door, bearing witness to the confrontation that was to come. Poirot himself sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, his hands folded neatly, his eyes alight with that peculiar gleam which heralded revelation. I took my place to his right, notebook in hand, though I confess my pulse beat faster than the calm facade I attempted to maintain. "My friends," Poirot began, his voice measured and deliberate, "the hour has come. For days you have lived with suspicion, with fear, with doubt. Tonight I shall sweep away the fog. I shall show you who struck down Lady Eleanor." To Clara. "Mademoiselle, your fear was real, but your spirit, too gentle. Your alibi, though weak, is corroborated by Jennings, who saw you at your embroidery near the fire until near 11. And more, your very nature recoils from violence. No, you are not the one." Clara let out a sob of relief. Poirot's gaze moved to Charles. "You lied, monsieur, about the billiard room. You were not there. You were, instead, on the telephone in the study, speaking with a creditor even as the storm raged. The operator recalls your voice. You concealed this to avoid disgrace, not to cover murder. Your guilt is of cowardice, not of blood." Charles flushed scarlet, but made no protest. Poirot regarded Miriam with unexpected gentleness. "You, ma pauvre enfant, you feared Lady Eleanor's discovery of your secret, your meeting with a young man in the village. You thought she might dismiss you. But fear of poverty does not equate to the courage to kill. And more, you were seen by the gardener returning late from that clandestine tryst. You were not near Lady Eleanor's door." Miriam gave a shuddering sob, burying her face in her hands. Poirot rose now, his figure small yet commanding. "And so we come to you, Edward, the dutiful son, the heir apparent. You who claimed to read in your chamber, yet whose shoes bore the mud of the terrace. You who spoke of Shakespeare, yet left your book unread. You who scoffed at the notion of a secret heir, because its truth would strip you of everything." Edward's face did not alter, but a faint sheen of sweat glistened upon his brow. Poirot produced the golden locket. It gleamed in the lamplight, delicate yet potent with meaning. With deft fingers he opened it. Within was a miniature portrait of a woman long dead, Lady Eleanor's sister, and opposite, in fine script, the initials A.W. "Anne Whitcomb," Poirot declared softly. The younger sister, disowned for a marriage displeasing to the family. Than disgrace, more than shame. You feared to lose the inheritance you prized above all else. For that fear, you killed. There was a terrible pause. Then Edward gave a broken laugh. And if I did, would any court condemn me on the word of a foreigner and a ribbon of silk? This is my house, my land, my birthright. Poirot's eyes flashed. No, monsieur, it was never your birthright. The law will decide, not I. But in this room, among these witnesses, the truth is known. And the truth, it is a thing that cannot be buried, not even by murder. Edward's composure crumbled, his face twisted in rage, then despair. With a cry, he sank into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands. The silence that followed was heavy with finality. Clara wept quietly. Charles muttered oaths. Miriam clung to the back of a chair as though for support. Jennings, grave as ever, slipped quietly from the room to summon the authorities. Poirot, unmoved, closed the locket and placed it upon the mantelpiece. There, he said softly, it rests, not as a weapon of fear, but as a symbol of justice. Lady Eleanor may rest now, knowing her secret is preserved, her child acknowledged, her murderer unmasked. He turned, and his eyes met mine. You see, Hastings, once again, it is the little things. A ribbon, a book unread, the mud upon a shoe. They are the threads. Together they weave the pattern. Without them, the great tapestry of truth cannot be seen. I nodded, though my throat was tight. Poirot straightened his cuffs. And now, mes amis, our task here is ended. The law shall take its course. We shall leave Whitcomb Manor to its ghosts and its memories. But remember always, the truth, it may be delayed, but it is never defeated. The fire sank low. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, and in the stillness of that somber room, justice, at last, had spoken.